All right, I think we're good. We still have people coming in. We will be sharing this recording and the materials afterwards. So if anybody misses the first part of the conversation, no worries. Good afternoon, good day, good morning, depending on where you are, everyone. And welcome to Dario's expert webinar series titled Back to the Office Bootcamp. I'm Carol Nugent, Vice President of Employer Sales at Dario Health, and I will be your host throughout our three-part series. Throughout the webinar, we really are aiming to offer perspective, data insights, trends, and really what I think most importantly, actionable thought leadership that you can take back with you. As you all know, and as we've all experienced, the complexity and nuances of return to office has been on everyone's minds. Specifically, how do we transition employees back from their home offices, from their hybrid models, and other unusual working scenarios, like perhaps working from your own bed, which I've seen many people do after 18 months of pandemic life? That really is going to include taking into consideration a holistic aspect of people's health and really the effects on physical, social, financial, and mental health. And then also equally as importantly, the effects of those factors on their loved ones and their coworkers. Today's webinar is really focused on the long tail of the mental health pandemic. This last year, I think we can all agree, brought recognition to the importance of access to mental health care as we all were plunged into some aspect of isolation and really uneven waves of fear and confusion. And now we're dealing with the after effects of that. A recent survey found that 1 in 3 people reported experiencing psychological distress during the pandemic, and those are just the people that are actually reporting it, ultimately creating a twin pandemic of mental health needs. And now that we see a potential light at the end of the tunnel, many are experiencing what we would call PTSD-like symptoms with the stress of returning to pre-pandemic behavior, what that's going to look like. So to that end, today, Dr. Navya Singh, a clinical psychologist by training, co-founder of Way Forward by Dario, our chief behavioral science officer, and also in her spare time, an adjunct faculty in the Department of Psychiatry at Columbia University, will spend time delving into the mental health pandemic and what organizations can really do to support their employees for a safe return to the office. Some administrative items before we get started. Please feel free to submit your questions throughout our time today, and we will address them at the end. And as I mentioned, we will send a replay of our conversation in case we missed anything. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Navya.
Thanks, Carol. Hi, everyone. So, as we all know, the reason why we are here is that the past year has seen unprecedented events globally, which, have had a deep impact on our emotional, physical, and social existence. Basically, everything that we did was disrupted, and the way in which we did things was completely changed. Carol talked about working from your bed to, homeschooling kids to, being in fear of one's health and safety. Everything was disrupted, and there was a pervasive sense of isolation, loss, general distress, and of things being unpredictable and out of our control. So having seen all these things, while we were, seeing all these things during the pandemic, we really wanted to find out what each individual's experience was within these settings as they dealt with all of these changes. And we conducted multiple surveys with people from various age groups, asking about the different types of problems that they might have encountered, ranging from depression, anxiety, to the more everyday stressors, relationship problems, conflicts. And we wanted to listen carefully and know each person's subjective experience related to the type and severity of the problems they were experiencing. And as you can see in this nice little heat map that we created people from all walks of life, all age groups, were experiencing elevated levels of distress, of all kinds of distress. Obviously, it varied depending on type and age and severity of the problem. So we can see that um, young adults, 18 to 24-year-olds, were feeling more anxious, heightened levels of anxiety. And it makes sense. These are the folks that are entering into the workforce or making plans for the future. And as all these plans were seemingly disrupted, where the future was so uncertain, it explains the high levels of anxiety. Stress, extremely high levels of stress, again, between ages 18 to 45. People in the workforce, people who are maybe managing work and family and have stresses related to their selves, their future, financial, uh, all of this. So when we looked at this data closely, we really wanted to see, and we saw other things. We collected data on other things too, COVID related distress, how people wanted to utilize care, what modalities of care would be better for them in their situation. And as we looked at all this data, our attempt was to figure out how to provide solutions. Now that we know what the problem is, the next stage is to find a solution that can serve everyone on this spectrum, no matter what type of their need is or what level. So next, because we saw such elevated levels of distress, we also saw changes in how people wanted to utilize the care that they were given. And as you can see on this slide here, um, there was a shift. And in some ways, the gap widened. As people needed more care, we were not able to provide all of that care in the moment, tailored to the person's needs. We all know mental health is extremely complex. It's nuanced. Disorders are on a spectrum, and it's episodic in nature. Today I might be struggling from a certain problem, and I might feel better tomorrow, and in 6 months, something else might happen. So, and unfortunately, in mental health, we don't have a silver bullet or a magic pill that can take care of everything in one go. So, the ideal solution that we have would be specific to the individual's need. Would solve it. It cannot be, telehealth for everyone, in person for everyone, self-use, be it CBT or DBT for everyone. And when I talk of this, I'm often reminded of this patient who came to me about 1 year after they started experiencing some form of distress, some sort of depressive symptoms, sadness. And for about a year, they tried to do different things, use a lot of self-use, self-guided meditation sort of programs, and it helped to the extent that it kept the person going. But by the time they showed up um, in therapy to a therapist, it was something that had escalated and could have been avoided or prevented if the person sought the right kind of care when they were experiencing the symptoms. On the other hand, not everyone needs such high touch care at all times. A lot of our problems are everyday life related problems, episodic, in the moment, that can be really easily tackled by low touch types of solutions, self-use, coaching. So again, we need to figure out what each individual's need is, and also keep in mind things like stigma related to seeking help. Now, I think the only or silver lining of this pandemic was that people were able to talk about mental health problems. They were able to come up and say, yes, I'm struggling, and this is where my struggle lies. But having said that, we're still scratching the surface when it comes to actually tackling the stigma problem. The other problem is diversity. Even before the pandemic, people in certain groups or certain sections of society found it harder to access care. The pandemic just made that disparity wider. And our aim is to bring parity to mental health care so that, 80% of the people walking in through the door get rightly assessed for the problem, for their need, and are provided the right kind of care in the moment, and that's effective. Which brings me to the next topic that we'll talk about, which is, we call it the recovery problem, but it's basically looking at the range of problems that people encountered during this pandemic. And as we talk about problems during the pandemic, Carol mentioned traumas, and I really think that the topic of trauma needs to be addressed here, because everyone struggled through immense stress. It was on a range, but our stresses were heightened. So a little bit about my personal background. Before doing what I do right now, my research was focused on trauma survivors. I worked with Rwandan genocide survivors in Rwanda and those who migrated to the US as asylum seekers and refugees. I also worked with 9/11 first responders. And through all of this work, what I learned was that when I looked at the narratives, when we look at the narratives of trauma survivors, we understand two things. One, that the experience of trauma is subjective. Two individuals within the same situation can experience things very differently, and the response can be very different, which doesn't mean that one person's experience is less or more than the other, or there's any right or wrong way to experience a potentially traumatic event, or that someone who's smiling maybe is less distressed. Um, it's just that people respond differently to the same level or type of distress. And this response depends on various things. It could be their past, their personality, but most importantly, their support system. How people cope with the trauma, how people respond to it, depends a lot on the resources they had. So that's something that we really wanted to focus on. The other thing to highlight here when we talk of trauma or distress is that inherently most of us as individuals have strength, we're resilient. So human beings are inherently adaptive, we're resilient. However, it becomes our job as care providers to enhance that resilience, to make sure that longer term, when we take care of people, when we provide care, we're not missing out people who need high levels of care, and we're enhancing or augmenting the strength that's there inherently within each individual. We're tackling social issues such as stigma, isolation, loneliness, loss, problems not just with the individual we're serving, but with their extended network, their family, their friends, um, and tackling the sense of fear and hopelessness. Hope is key. The day we stop seeing hope for the future, which happened a lot during the pandemic, there was financial, there was loss of physical, fear of physical harm of loved ones. So those are things that we need to keep in mind as we talk about recovery. And that takes me to the next part of the conversation of how to, as we help people recover, we need to understand the new worries or stressors that have now come up as we ask people to get back to the workforce. Now, this can be remote work, it can be work, back to work, physically back to work, which a lot of people are doing now, or a hybrid model. Where we are asking people to work remotely and coming back and forth between work and not. We're hearing about the Great Resignation, or some people are calling it the Great Reshuffle, where people in certain demographics might be more comfortable coming back to work, whereas others, might not be. What we're seeing is that people who were in the workforce for a longer time are maybe missing that. They're missing the, conversations next to the water cooler, and are more eager or readily, able to come back. There are people who got used to this kind of a life, who started their work life in the past few years, and they've now understood this or adapted to this new sort of way or work-life balance. So they may be wanting to keep that. Change is hard for anyone, so we have to understand that we asked people to change everything, about 1.5 years ago, and now we're asking them to change everything again. So it can be really hard. Uh, but we need to understand the problems here. We need to understand the different problems that people are undergoing. We talked about how different people were experiencing different things related to where they were, the demographic. We know a lot of women had to leave the workforce or are thinking about leaving the workforce because now they're responsible for taking care of the household in ways which they weren't. These are things to think about. Can we afford to lose, let's say, half of our workforce of human potential that are able to contribute, that want to contribute? And, we have to remember that most people want to work. If they're showing up to work digitally or in person, they want to contribute to work, to society. It's our job now to understand the barriers to that. What's stopping them from entering in a way that they can and we can realize the full human potential. So things to think about here are things such as worry. Now, worry is a tricky thing because some worry is good. If we didn't worry about making it on time to work or to the next meeting, we would be late. If we didn't worry about our kids when they took out the card for the first time, we might not put a lot of the checks and balances in place that we do. So some worry is okay. Worry in certain situations is okay, but worry has a way of escalating, and we want to figure out if people are worried about what they're doing, and we want to make all these assessments or think about all these things in a non-judgmental way, from a perspective of empathy. We've all been through a lot, and how do we listen to people? How do we escalate? How do we stop things from escalating while we have a stance that is respectful of everyone? People are at different places in their journey of healing, of getting through this pandemic, getting back to work, getting back to the new normal. The new normal was last year. Now the slightly different normal. Um, and how do we have those conversations in a way that is respectful, that is non-judgmental, that is empathic? Our problem might not be the same as the other person's, but we've all experienced it. So how do we do that? How do we um, find a balance? People got used to certain ways of working. We talked a lot about the work-life balance during the pandemic as people were having Zoom meetings. When we change that, how do we again help people find a new balance? um, Maybe keeping some things from the pre-COVID settings or certain things that people got used to doing while they were adjusting to the past 1 year. I often think of how when we started working on Zoom and people's children would come into meetings. Initially, it was a little different for me. I didn't know what to make of it personally, but now I've gotten used to it. I think it's fine if it doesn't stop. I don't think it interrupts or stops anything from happening. And I've actually started acknowledging that. Acknowledging the child. I say hello. Put everyone at ease, and then everyone's able to get back to work. So things like that. Acknowledging the fact that we might not have control over everything. We're hearing about a new strain coming up. Things might change again or not. So I think working from there, addressing the fact that we don't have as much control as we might want, and then developing solutions that take all these things into account while we work to bring people back to work, back to their old settings, or a hybrid model. And that brings me to the conclusion uh, of my part of the back to work dialogue, but I would encourage people to ask questions and bring their questions, their concerns, anything that they might have.
So thank you, Navia. That was wonderful, very insightful. I think if we talk about what I sort of lasered in and we have up here is, are we making sure that we are providing our employees and their families the solutions that they need to ultimately recover in some capacity from this pandemic? And the questions that I see here, and I think that you touched on in the conversation, is um, are our mental health benefits and the providers associated with those benefits easily accessible to the population? Do they know where to go? Do they have enough health literacy to access them in the appropriate fashion? Are mental health benefits really being tailored to the needs of the population, um, who admittedly all have diverse needs, regardless of what the diversity dimensions that are at play are for each one of them? And then I think the third one is, do we have the flexibility, not just to adapt, because you're right, and we talk about this every day. It is extremely important to react to people's behavior and how they are changing and how their preferences are changing and what is engaging them in a particular day. But more importantly, I think, are we doing it quickly enough so that it could still be applicable in a moment's time? Did I cover that appropriately? Did I miss anything in that?
Sorry, I was on mute. I think that sums it up beautifully. I think, the idea of having a benefit that's flexible and adapts to each individual's unique needs, however, is also able to do that in the moment, um, adapt quickly, adapt fast, and takes into consideration the fact that people are unique and diverse, and we cannot miss that while um, creating any sort of a solution, because we do need to help 80% of the people walking through our door. And it's only possible if we understand in a very non-judgmental way that people experience distress in different ways, people express different distress in different ways, and they might be in different stages of their journey in terms of healing and recovery, especially given the extent of the distress experienced during the pandemic.
Yeah. And you mentioned earlier on about the increase in telehealth utilization, and I have a couple of friends, and we're always discussing a couple of aspects of this. Is that even with the increase, we still see that there's a gap because it's certainly not the right fit for everyone. So my first question is, how can we be sure that we're providing resources that work across a wide spectrum of needs? And then separately, my second question out of curiosity to you is, do you think we will ever go back to in person the way we used to be, or at the same, I guess, velocity as we used to see in-person therapists?
Those are excellent questions. I think the key is to ask. We cannot know anything if we don't ask. So the key is to ask and listen in an empathic and non-judgmental way, but to know how to ask the right questions. So in order for us to know the exact solution for any given organization at the organizational level or at the individual level, is to be able to ask the right questions, is to be able to triage people to the right specific kind of care that's good for them in the moment, and also provide the option of switching or changing, right? Someone might need low touch care today, but their needs might escalate at a later time, or someone might need more prolonged or intensive care right now, but their needs might change later on. So as we think about mental health care, the key is to be able to assess people in the right way and ask the right questions in order to get to the right solution. So I would say that's the key there. That's how we design a solution. That's inherently the infrastructure is adaptive, but it's adaptive to being able to ask and then tell and then ask again through feedback and through ongoing data collection. We need to be able to personalize the solution to everyone. um, the other question, going back to in person, that's a tricky one because it depends on so many different things. The reason that we initially had, even before the pandemic, there were always barriers to accessing care, because in-person therapy, it's great. I've done it myself. I love the experience. It's something different to, see the patient in the room. However, I don't think that should become a barrier to care. And when that starts becoming the reason why people aren't able to access therapy, if therapy is the right solution for them, right? Um, then we need to change how we think about things. So yes, after the pandemic, I do see people going back to in-person therapy, but when it's convenient for them, when they can commute, when they can make time for it. However, if it's the difference between having care versus not, I think we all need to be flexible and need to be able to do teletherapy or sessions over Zoom, like we're doing right now. This would have been perhaps an in-person seminar, but now it's a webinar, and we're all gaining out of it. It's some things might be even better than in person because we can ask questions. They can, there are these other things. So again, that would be my long response to this question. But
Yeah, and you hit on something that's interesting to me because there are two separate chasms here. One is telehealth versus in person. And I think you're absolutely right. You have to ask, where is the preference? We need to meet the member where they are as opposed to telling them this is where you need to be. But I think in addition to that, and beyond that, we have to offer other mediums, whether it is self-guided stuff, because people deal with that. Some people like that better, whether it is somebody who perhaps doesn't need to be a clinician because the turnaround time to get an appointment with someone and the coordination around that is difficult. I think it's really sort of putting an umbrella on top of the population's mental well-being, understanding that there are going to be a lot of different pathways to get them engaged in the appropriate way, and ensuring that we have all of those pathways structured.
absolutely, absolutely. And that's where, asking the right questions and triaging people to the right level of care is really important, because not everyone needs therapy. But people do have ongoing emotional needs, emotional health needs, and distress, which can be served very well, perhaps by a self-service, a self-guided program, behavioral health coaching, or other modalities or combinations of these two or three different things. And that's again where we need to really figure out where people are, at large and individually. So when we saw the heat map survey, one of the other things that we asked when we did those surveys was how people like to utilize their mental health care, given that things were changing. And we asked about these various different modes of care that you mentioned. And we saw again across age groups that using uh, use a self-guided program, which is based in science, which is evidence-based, as well as modalities such as behavioral health coaching. A lot of people said that they would do that. I think it was over 58% people who said they would be happy with, these forms of care, coaching. And then I think the self-guided was even higher, because it helped them in the moment. It was something that fulfilled their need. But yeah, that's where we're seeing that paradigm shift that we talked about in how people are able to and willing to consume care, which is right for them and which is effective.
Here's and thank you all for the questions that are coming in. We'll try to get to as many of them as possible. One of them that just came up that I know Dr. Singh resonates for me is within my own family, within my own circle of friends, we are all at different levels of comfort in terms of returning to pre-pandemic. And it's not just how we feel about it, but it's also how we are reacting to what other people in the group feel about it. And I think that that gets exponentially hard when it's not someone who's in your direct inner circle, as they say. How do managers and those that are leading employee populations at work balance them, not only to give comfort to everyone, but to also, to an extent, train everyone to respect other people's feelings?
Right. And I think that's an excellent question. And what I would like to say there is just start from a stance of empathy, that, my experience might be different from yours. However, we have all been through this huge global event. And even if this event hadn't happened, if we were just talking about general distress and how, managers might respond to distress within, their teams, we don't always have firsthand experience dealing with things that we have to address with other people, especially in emotional health. Even a therapist that you might see might not have experience with all of the things that you might bring into the room, right? But the key here is to engage in empathic listening and to understand that it's not our place to judge, but it's our place to understand from the person's perspective, that the perspective that we might not have firsthand. However, we can try to understand from their point of view what's going on. And as soon as we start speaking from that perspective, we'll create a safe space where people can come in and share, where people know that, I as a manager might not have had that experience, but I'm open to listening. I'm open to, I might not be able to promise a solution, right? Let's say we're all mandated to come back to work, to in-person work, right? That might not be even up to my direct manager that I report to, or even leadership, because the nature of the work is such, or the organization has certain mandates. But the idea is that if we're asking people to do that, first of all, acknowledging that we understand that you might not be comfortable doing this, we understand that you might not have control over this, which in and of itself is distressing. However, we're here to listen and to help with whatever we can. I have control over these things. One of them is listening to you, right? And trying to understand. And then within that, if we can provide some accommodation, then being open to providing that accommodation, because at the end of the day, we really need to remember two things. One, people inherently want to work, they want to be productive. Rather, the lack of productivity is what makes them anxious or nervous or worry. So keeping that in mind, we need to talk to people like, I understand you want to come up here to work and be the best self, the best worker, the best, human being that you are. How can I help you? Certain things are within my control, certain things aren't. And secondly, respecting the fact that people might be in different places when it comes to their recovery journey. Some people might be more anxious given their experiences. Some people might be less. And if possible, trying to accommodate to that, but at least understanding and providing them with solutions that can help them, in their emotional wellness, their journey. And I think those are the key elements of structuring a return to work program, not just from the emotional health perspective, but from, training people to address these needs, to picking up on these needs. I often tell people, just because someone's smiling doesn't mean that they're okay. We need to ask, and we need to genuinely ask. So, that genuine listening and empathy needs to be woven into every conversation.
And I think that that is where all of those dimensions of well-being, whether it's physical, social, financial, and of course mental, come into play. Another question that we just received, I think this is a brilliant question, is how do we measure how we're doing? This is new landscape for us. How do we know if we are serving our population appropriately in the respect that we've spoken to today?
So I might sound like a broken record, but we will never know the answer till we ask. And the idea is to check in. Now, asking can be of different kinds. It can be informal checking in to formalized assessments, diagnostics, surveys that you can do with your overall population. It can be tailored to different people in the employee setting or the population, because different people might have had different experiences. Um, Overall, as an employer, if you want to know how you're doing, again, it might need to be a multi-tiered, multi-level approach where it's, asking people at different levels informally, their subjective experience, but also some kind of a formal assessment of how people are doing. Also, just looking at people's desire or ability to stay, right? Are a lot of people coming in and saying, I just cannot come back to work, or this is not working out? Are people being able to talk about it? Secondly, if they are, what are they saying? Are a lot of people saying a certain thing? If yes, then we need to sort of, zoom into that and look at what's going on. If 70% of the people or 50% of the people are talking about a specific thing, maybe it's time to listen to that or tailor the conversation to that. So again, we will only know how we're doing when we get feedback, but we should be open to taking that feedback and listening to it. It's sometimes hard to not just get feedback, but to accept it. And I think that the first thing that we need to do is acceptance is key here. Acceptance of the fact that a lot has happened, and we will see we're calling it the long tail. There is a long tail of the pandemic. So, we can't just stop. Things will not vanish overnight. Things won't, snap into back to 2019 December or whenever, these things happen. And we need to be able to accept the fact that we're also trying. So as an organization, if you're trying to see how you're doing, maybe don't compare it to pre-pandemic, but have this like graduated approach. How are we doing compared to the last 6 months? Last 6 months, how did we do compared to that? And then slowly try to get back to if we ever get back to before everything started. So
And you differentiated something that I think is really key, is asking doesn't always look the same to everybody. And I think the solutions in the market that are resonating the most are the ones that are digital first, where stigma is minimized and people tend to be more forthcoming in that medium. And I think very similarly to what you're saying, you don't have to ask face to face, ask digitally, and you will perhaps get more genuine answers.
Absolutely. And we've seen that in our own experience, where in some ways a digital questionnaire or screening or diagnostic it's agnostic to the person who's responding. And the person who's responding knows that, when I walk into a room and talk to someone, I'm aware of the fact that I'm a certain kind of person, I'm a certain demographic, I am, be it gender, be it ethnicity, be it other more nuanced things that people might not be able to see on the surface. I'm aware of that. And I might be more consciously, thinking about those things when I'm talking to someone in person. In an organization, there are hierarchies that we're all, aware of, even though the person at the other end might not be thinking of that, but I, as a respondent, as a user, might be. Whereas when I go and I use a technology first solution, a digital first solution, that solution isn't judging me on, who I am, the language I speak, the gender, the everything else, all of the diversity that I bring in. And I think that's why it's easier to relate to it, right? But then at the other end, we also need to tell people that as we ask you about your problems in this very protected and very neutral setting, at the other end of it, if you do require a solution that's a combination of digital and human to various degrees, low touch or high touch, we're able to provide that.
Right. We need the framework for all, but perhaps with a digital first, and then let people decide what their comfort level is.
Exactly. And we can help them with that, in making that sort of consideration for themselves or finding that solution for themselves, right? Digital can be highly digital, low touch in person, or it can be a combination. So it doesn't always have to be the same level or extent. And we can help people make, that decision for themselves.
And asking for a friend, what are your thoughts on dogs in the office?
Love them.
Okay, that's good. That's great. I'll make sure to include that in the notes. I think that was the most important question that was just asked of us.
Absolutely. They're therapeutic, know that. Sorry.
Yeah. Um, what have you seen in the market? And this is because of a combination of questions we just received. What has been most successful in reducing stigma? I know that we generally see it reduced when there are people that we trust who admit to it and who speak about it, whether those are celebrities or mentors or family members. Where have you seen it resonate the most, and make I just got a really funny comment in the chat that I'll share with everyone, make a dent the most?
I think you're absolutely right. I think something like stigma, where a person suffers internally or struggles internally, that's the whole thing about stigma. That the person struggles internally but is unable to talk about it because they feel like they'll be judged or their voice isn't important enough or strong enough to be heard. And that's why when celebrities or people in positions of power talk about things like mental health, there's a normalizing of it, like, oh, that person can talk about it, that person, because the reason that stigma is also that we associate these things with weakness, whereas they shouldn't be. They're not.
Yeah.
All of us are human. The fact that we're human makes us vulnerable, and that's our strength, rather than saying I'm not, I never suffer, I never struggle. There's strength in that vulnerability, in the fact that I'm a human being, and that's why I bring all these different things to the table that are my potential. So again, we tend to overlook that because society in some ways has made us think that if you talk about something, especially in the mental health realm, it's a weakness. So but when celebrities, people in power talk about it, it normalizes it. If that person can say it, then maybe so can I. When more people talk about it, there's comfort in numbers. So as we see more and more people talk about it, at a mass level. But going back to your first point, I see often that in organizations where leadership talks about initiatives like this, where the leaders in the organization say, it's okay to seek mental health care, and this is what we're bringing for you, and I endorse it, there is huge uptake. It's just, you can actually see it in the numbers, where anyone from top, when they talk about it, when they say, when they're part of the, be it the launch or be the endorsement of any sort of a solution, people accept it. And this was before the pandemic too, not just during
Right.
it, but in general, when we see that people we look up to in families, if a parent is saying it's okay to go to therapy or to feel vulnerable, or it's okay to talk about it, come to me if you're struggling, if you're being bullied, it's okay, I will listen to you, I won't say don't talk about these things, or aren't, you're so weak. That's where children talk about it. That's where children, don't suffer in silence. And those are the kind of dialogues we need to facilitate at home and in the workplace, where we want the people who have a position of power, use it, use that, use your influence, again, be it individual, at home, or at work.
Yeah. And I think that there are so many different dimensions to that. Different segments of the population deal with it differently. Men want to be masculine. Women don't want to be too emotional. Those of us that come from different cultures, just based on hierarchy of feelings, mental health was never prioritized, and you are deemed weak if you talk about something that you can't really see or touch. So there's so many dimensions to be able to adjust. And being, I know it matters to me. I've seen a leader at Dario say to me, I'm taking a mental health day on Friday. And that sort of blew my mind, that it was just so, awesome. And I can tell you, even with my boss, with things like when he has a day off, he has a day off, and that gives me the flexibility to do the same and not feel like I need to be in tune all the time. So I think those little steps that we take in our daily lives really helps the stigma, but we certainly have a long way to go, right?
Absolutely. We have a long way to go, and that's why we need to keep talking about this. And, you know, not worry so much about the consequences. I, as a woman, if I need to take time off to take care of my child, will I be seen as someone, who's not good enough to work? Or, is it okay for me to say that? And again, like you said, if my supervisor or my boss, if the person I look up to says that, that gives me the strength to now, say that. And I know it's not taking away from my productivity. It might actually increase it if I'm not burdened by constantly thinking about what will they say, or what will happen, or what will happen if they know that I'm this or that, or, that's a burden on me. That's actually taking away from my productivity. Whereas if I can say, I need a half a day off for this, but I know that it won't impact my level of productivity or the quality of work, I'm actually able to function better. And I have more allegiance to the organization, to the people who are enabling me to be my best.
Absolutely.
My best.
And the output is better, right? If you have allegiance to those folks.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And my best, as I see myself, see myself as someone who is X, Y, and Z. So we're taking care of all those aspects of the individual self. And again, going back to our conversation about people's journey within this pandemic, they might be at different places. you know if we can see them as whole people who are there, who are part of the workforce, part of society, and then take care of all those different aspects of their life,
Right.
so that they as a whole person can function. And Carol, you talked about the physical health aspects, the social, the emotional. I think that's where we need to go.
Absolutely. A bit of a different topic, but that just came into the chat, but it reminds me of, I want to say, 5 to 10 years ago, as we were helping employers really market and promote preventative care, physical care. We had to help create a narrative to say it's okay for costs to go up in preventative care, because the long tail of it is that it's going to help with costs tremendously in a year or two. And there's something very similar happening now. We've had EAP utilization generally be very, very low, but as
Mhm.
different mediums are becoming available, as different solutions are becoming available, I mean, we're seeing it in our own book of business, an incredible amount of engagement that I've never seen in my career. And how do we help managers of employees and those that really have to prove a point to their decision makers to say, it's okay if we have an increase in cost in this space right now? How do we help sort of shape that commentary?
I think that's an excellent point, and I feel like a couple of things here. One, we've seen utilization go up during the pandemic, and yes, people have a lot more distress. But pre-pandemic also, there was a certain prevalence of mental health, emotional wellness problems in our society, in the workforce, that maybe was not being addressed. So the pandemic has given us the voice, the platform to talk about it. But I absolutely agree with you. I wouldn't even formulate it as a high cost right now versus a low cost then, because overall it's a much lower cost in terms of dollar amounts, which we all care about, but cost in terms of human potential too, right?
Right.
We look at the cost of, we talked about the great resignation, all these people that can potentially leave the workforce. We'll have to replace that. We need to keep functioning, right? In all walks of life, all kinds of employers, all kinds of jobs need to go on. And so we really need to focus on preventative care, and that's why the digital first options are great, because the preventative, the low to moderate, the people who we can, if we are able to access them right now, if we're able to pick up on their needs right now, we will be able to provide the right solution to them in the moment, where if we can prevent those needs from escalating, overall, we're solving so many problems of, yes, dollar costs, of loss of productivity, of, the hidden burdens, the hidden costs too. Not just that they'll, end up utilizing a more expensive solution down the line, but they're less productive. They might leave the workforce. What are the costs of replacement? All these things. So definitely, the one thing I owe to the pandemic is that people like me are able to now talk about this thing that we've been wanting to talk about for a while. Mental health is important. It was important before the pandemic, and it will continue to be important afterwards. As we see, yes, I was the one who said that overall the population is resilient, and we'll sort of come back to baseline if we help people properly, right? We can't just let people be, but if we provide the right care, we'll see over time, maybe in the next year or two, people are, returning to, at an average, returning to baseline. But that baseline also needs help. The baseline also had problems. There were issues
Yeah.
there, the
Oh,
issues of
yeah.
stigma, diversity. Certain sections of the population never had good access. So we can't forget about that, and we definitely shouldn't forget that prevention is definitely better than cure.
Yeah. Perhaps a silver lining to all of this to end our discussion today. Well, thank you, Dr. Singh, so much for your time. I feel like I can sit on the phone with you for another hour and just ask you questions about anything. Thank you all for joining us today. We hope it was a good use of your time. Please remember that our next two sessions will be on August 25th and September 8th. They will be focused on employees' musculoskeletal needs as they return to the office. We all know that that is needed, as well as a return to normal health care, both from a preventive and chronic conditions perspective. So August 25th, September 8th, please go on and register. Anything you need in the interim, before or after, please feel free to reach out to us directly. Thank you all so much. Have a good rest of your week.
Thanks. Thank you.